Good afternoon, audience. Welcome to Werewolf episode number 8 with a guest today from South Africa, Dr. Dan Roodt, Afrikaner from origin, Afrikaans linguist, academic publicist, also somebody quite familiar to European dissidents from his podcasts in Jared Taylor's shows. We are very honored to have you today with us, Mr. Roodt. And please correct me about your name. How do we pronounce it in English? What's the correct way?
Yes, you can just say Dan because it's sort of an anglicized. I'm Daniel, but when I studied at an English university here in Johannesburg, and then I became Dan over there. So yes, it's just a normal. But now I've heard that in Scandinavia there is a form Dan, which is a sort of a more pagan kind of Nordic name. So. Yes, I don't mind that either. So you could, but yeah, I think in an English context, maybe the Dan sounds better.
Well, thank you. Just to give the audience that is not familiar with your work a little bit of a background, we are speaking, in fact, me and you, the same language, Dutch and Afrikaans. They're quite close, they're brother languages. But of course, we'll do this episode, the podcast in English to make other people aware, other speakers aware of the plight of your people, the situation of the Afrikaner people, and also to tell them a little bit about history that many of them don't know. About you, that you are a writer in Afrikaans, a publicist, and that you are somebody that actually stands with both feet very deep in the Afrikaans culture. If your Wikipedia information is correct, then your father was actually born in the Krugerhuis, which I used to visit in Pretoria, which is now a museum, of course. Paul Kruger, of course, being the president of Transvaal, the independent Boer Republic, till 1902. Is that correct, that information from Wikipedia?
Yes, that is correct, because after the Anglo-Boer War, and especially there was there was a lot of poverty in South Africa, and then at some point in the 1920s, the Paul Kruger's house in Pretoria, his presidential residence, was turned into a maternity home for Afrikaner women, and it was there that my dad was born as a result of that. And he also spent some time in the Eastern Cape, but he was also, although he did some, he did a lot of things in his life. He also studied Afrikaans and Dutch literature, and he was a great fan of the Dutch poet R. Roland Holst. And I remember growing up, even at an early age, he would read some of R. Roland Holst's poems to me. And R. Roland Holst also visited this country while my dad was still a student at university. And there was a whole, and he met him personally and so on, and it made a big impression on him. And he met my mom on a trip to Europe. They went by ship, and as part of a student tour group, and they met there on the ship. And my dad also visited the Netherlands, and he did some ice skating on. It was in winter, and he did some ice skating on the rivers and the canals there with another Dutch lady who was his pen friend, and I think her name was Annie de Bruin. And then, but he then eventually got married to my mother here in South Africa. So my whole origin is also a bit of a European one, and I grew up with these sort of black and white pictures of museums in Europe and tales about the Netherlands and Italy and Switzerland and France and so on. So, yes.
Well, you are definitely part of what we would call high culture in South Africa. You have been working with, been acquaintances with, and friends with many famous writers and publicists in your country. Of course,
in fact,
Breiten
my
Breitenbach.
dad,
Yes.
just if I may interrupt you, my dad was he was best friends at university with somebody called Koos Himon, who later became one of the biggest Afrikaans publishers, and whose publishing company was eventually taken over by the Naspers group. And the Naspers group is now, there's some sort of a Dutch connection there as well, because it's now listed in the Netherlands as a public company, and I think it's the most valuable company in South Africa. Although it started off as ironically, it's now a global kind of an internet company, but it started off as a nationalist newspaper in the Cape called Die Burger, the Burger or the Citizen. And for the first half of the 20th century, it was for the Afrikaner. And during the 1930s, there was a schism here in the National Party, and and only 4 people remained in the one faction, the sort of more hardcore nationalist faction. And then the Burger had to choose whether they went with the majority faction or with the minority one, and they chose the minority one. And from there, they fought back until in 1948, they won the elections here, and of course then followed about 40 years of Afrikaner rule in South Africa, which caused worldwide controversies, but it was also a golden age for Afrikaans culture and for South Africa generally. There was so many Europeans who wanted to immigrate here, Swiss and Austrians and Germans and British people. Yes, Dutch people as well. Lots of Dutch people immigrated here during the 1960s. So yeah, South Africa, that was really our golden age in the 1960s and early 1970s until all the controversies around internal policies started to make headlines overseas, and yeah, we might go into that and why it happened and so on. But just that's a sort of a brief introduction.
Well, you talk about the high years of the culture of South Africa, and how interested people were to emigrate there. It was a very international place. I was one of the people that wanted to immigrate. I did it very late, 93. And I recall coming into a country that was still under old government, let's say. And it was like coming to New York, coming to Johannesburg. That's the experience I had over there. It was a very cosmopolitan place, and you yourself have a very cosmopolitan background as well. So people, they tend to associate you now with, let's say, nationalist Afrikaans movement. But if we look at your history and we look at South Africa, how it was before, we get a entirely different picture. Just to indicate our audience, you were living in Joville. I lived nearby in Berea, which was near to the highlight place called Hillbrow, of course, in that time. It was a very vibrant, cosmopolitan place. Avant-garde artists were living there. Immigrants from all over Europe were coming there, still even at that time. And it was the South Africa that was attracting people for all kinds of reasons, cultural reasons as well. It had a cultural boom. People will recall the years of Paul Simon's Graceland album, which made South African music world famous in many regards. Of course, that all came to an end quite rapidly. 94, there was a crime wave, immigration wave from other African countries. And of course, the AIDS epidemic and white flight, of course, took over. So that's the background that I've seen. And of course, you have experienced that very closely. I will give a sentence in Afrikaans that you have written on the site, dealing with Afrikaans people, where you have a profile as a writer. And you write there this: Afrikaners is die groep mensen tegen wie die meeste gediscrimineerd wordt. Onder apartheid wou niemand zwart wees niet, maar vandaag wil niemand een Afrikaner wees niet. Jij is heel onder. To translate, so the Afrikaner people are now people that are most discriminated in all of South Africa. Under apartheid, nobody wanted to be black, but today nobody wants to be an Afrikaner, and the Afrikaners are quite down under there. Well, this fits in, of course, with your experience. You were discriminated against already in 1979, I read, by not being issued a French visa, a student visa, because you were white, right?
Exactly. Yes, yes.
Yes, yes. So
They
you
told me
experienced it
that
very well.
quite bluntly at the French consulate here in Johannesburg. They told me, that, we give bursaries to black students, but you are white, so, we can't give you a bursary. And so this kind of, call it an affirmative action or discrimination against white people was already being enacted by the Europeans at that time. And of course, and I eventually did end up in France and lived there for about 7 or 8 years. But the irony was that, even though, and at that time, we had the worst anti-South African, anti-Afrikaner publicity ever. That was during the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s. The irony was that even though the French administration was sort of hostile towards us, I never got stopped once by any French policeman in Europe because, I looked like European, whereas all the black students who got these bursaries from the French, they got stopped every day in the metro by the French police, who asked them for their papers. And a lot of them actually never, they didn't last more than 6 months in Paris because it was too foreign for them, and the language, they didn't learn the language properly and so on. So it's such a shame that that there should have been that kind of discrimination against us at the time, but it continues to the present day because of all the propaganda that that has been waged against us, in the latter half of the 20th century. We're still sitting with this this ballast or weight of propaganda and lies and misrepresentations about us and about South Africa, and it's very difficult to overcome that because if you don't have media and you don't have access to international forums and so on, and of course there was also the 1973 declaration of apartheid as a crime against humanity, which in itself was an absurdity. But I at some point I want to write something about that. But I've read some very interesting research about what happened in the 1950s and 1960s at the UN, but we won't. It's too complicated to go into here at the moment. But the interesting thing is that during that vote at the UN, which was brought by the Soviet Union and by, I think it was Guinea. Those were the two countries that brought that resolution in the General Assembly of the United Nations, and 4 countries voted against it: South Africa itself, as well as Portugal and Britain and the United States. And then some abstained. I think France and a few others abstained. And then a massive number of East European and African and Arab countries voted for that resolution. And of course, today, people are using this epithet of apartheid against Israel, which is another irony of history because, a lot of the more radicalized South African Jews, they did a lot to stigmatize the old government here and South Africa, and they played a big role in this whole kind of propaganda campaign against South Africa from abroad. But it's also one of the rare periods, I think, in history where West European countries and the USSR at the time and East Germany, they cooperated to actually bring down another country that used to be part of the Western orbit. And, we fought, we were so, I mean, we were one of the kind of founding members of the British Commonwealth in the 1930s. And we also fought in both world wars against, even though we were put in concentration camps by the British in 1900, we fought on the British and the Allied side in both the First and the Second World War and in Korea. And there was one incident, that one of the battles in the First World War, it actually took place on the 14th of July, 1916, or around about that date. And for a few days around that date. So it's sort of the French National Day, 14th of July, 1916. And we were fighting against the Germans. There was a South African contingent there of about 3,000 soldiers and about 120 officers, or slightly more than that even. But we were fighting against the Germans, and the British had promised us some relief troops that would come from some of the other, from the British side or the French side, I can't remember which. And they never came, and we essentially fought to the last man, and 3,000 of our people died there on the battlefield in France, in the Delbel Woods. And when I was still in France, they built a monument there to these people, our government. And then it was about December 1986. The president from here, P.W. Botha, he went over to France to officially open this monument, and they had a sculpture there that was bronze sculpture that was done by one of our local sculptors. And the French government wouldn't see him. They wouldn't. They actually ignored the whole visit, and they told him he wasn't welcome in South Africa. That was the French socialist government under Francois Mitterrand. So, there's an interesting book by Pim Fortuyn as well, where he talks about that his generation, they were the orphans. They sort of orphaned themselves because they rebelled against their parents, but the parents never did. They never. There was never a counter movement of kind of love and leadership for his generation. So he thought that his generation was a generation of orphans. But we are, in the same sense, we are sort of the orphans of the West, because we got rejected. We were just sent off to the orphanage, and they just forgot about us. And and I think that incident in socialist France in the 80s, that's for me symbolic of what happened to us. I mean, even though we fought to the last man for the West turned against us and betrayed us in so many ways.
Well, of course, for people not familiar with it, it's Pim Fortuyn. So that was, let's say, a Dutch populist, a very brilliant man, who was murdered in 2002. And he wrote in a book that you quote from, Verweesde Samenleving, so Orphan Society. Yeah, so it's quite applicable thought, what you're saying. From my side, I'm always struck by especially the betrayal of the Dutch towards the Afrikaners, because we are brother nations. We are very close in language, in religion, in habit, in everything, history. And it is amazing to see to what extent the Dutch have lost all feel and all connection with South Africa, which didn't used to be like that till I think the 60s. It was a very close relationship. So people from one country went to visit the other, literary people, artists. It was an exchange of students as well. And in Holland, everybody was aware of Afrikaner history. So street names were called after Boer generals, and it was a kind of a unity feeling, but it's completely gone, and that persists. That absence persists till today. So it's not just a historical phenomenon. What you're saying is also something that still occurs today. It's a point I wanted to bring up because you brought up the United Nations. So South Africa was condemned. Ironically, we now see that South Africa is the first in line to attack another so-called apartheid state, so Israel, and has launched famously, of course, a genocide case against in the international court system against Israel. The South African government has done that this year. I found it also very ironic because isn't it true that South Africa could be facing similar charges for what it's doing, or rather what it is preventing, action that it's preventing against such a thing in South Africa? The Afrikaner people, they have been subjected to, well, atrocious lawlessness, criminality, gang violence, the class murder, so the farm killings, that's famous. And at times it seems like there is a campaign of ethnic cleansing going on in South Africa. I don't know what's the state of that because Afrikaners are quite numerous, 2.5 million people living there, only white people, more Afrikaans speaking, of course. What's the current situation? How do you look at that? That South Africa is in the international arena pretending to be this moral force and internally not taking care of their own people. How do you look at that?
Yes, definitely. What you're saying is entirely correct, but I have a theory also that we've been. I mean, Lenin also wrote somewhere. I'll look up the text at some point because maybe I can write something about that. But he said that we were the first. The Boers in 1900 or 1899, we were the first anti-imperialist warriors. And that's true. We've been fighting against the British Empire for just about 2 centuries. And the British Empire has now morphed into this kind of globalist thing. But I think it's quite ironic that all the smaller countries around Britain, like the Netherlands and then Scandinavia, especially Sweden, I think they are more influenced by the English media, or they used to be, say, until, say, the 1980s or so, than many other countries, although everybody these days with the internet and so on is influenced by American and sort of globalist English media. But at that time, I think they were more influenced by what they were writing about us, in especially the more left-wing British press, than, say, in Germany or Switzerland or Austria. Because in the German-speaking world at the time, there was never, they never instituted sanctions against South Africa. And there was never this kind of hysteria against South Africa that you found in, say, Netherlands and Scandinavia and also in Canada to some extent. So I think that's one thing, that there was a certain influence of the Anglophone media in those countries. And of course, and it shows you also the effects of such propaganda, because I had a book here about Connie Braam and the Dutch anti-apartheid movement. And they sent about 80 Dutch people to South Africa who were essentially a sort of underground terrorists or something like that. And they were smuggling weapons and explosives. And one of them even got sort of caught, but he took refuge in the Dutch embassy in Pretoria. And as far as I recall, he lived in the embassy for 18 months.
Klaas de Jonge.
Klaas de Jonge. And eventually he was sort of swapped for some other prisoners or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, the Dutch were actually, I mean, that's the big irony of this whole thing, that people in the West were doing the same thing that some of the more extremist Islamic terrorists are currently doing against Western countries. They were doing that against us in the late 1970s and 1980s, which is absolutely scandalous. But there was apparently this whole UN thing was driven by the East Europeans and from the 1950s onwards, because they had especially after the invasion of Hungary by the Soviet Union, and they're sending the tanks to Hungary, they had a big image problem there, and there was a lot of criticism also at the UN about the lack of democratic rights and freedoms in Eastern Europe generally. And they devised this whole plan to actually attack the US on account of its race policies and segregation in the United States, as well as South Africa. But then eventually, after Kennedy, when he instituted affirmative action and there was the civil rights movement and so on, the entire focus shifted onto South Africa itself. And they had prepared this whole scheme, which was then applied to us. And they thought that we were sort of a weak link in the Western architecture, which in a way we were. And I think de Gaulle or somebody also said once that, that we were an essential pillar of Western civilization, and that we should be looked after and we should be strengthened. And probably that's why France sold us Mirage planes and so on, and weapons, while there were certain military sanctions against us. But I think the ultimate reason why we lost this whole thing is because we are too decent. We are not as Machiavellian and ruthless as our enemies, because we could have destroyed this whole ANC thing long ago if only we had wanted to, but our people were just the military, and they were very careful about what they were doing. And I mean, I've spoken to some of the old generals, and they told me that, for example, I think the ANC had two camps. They had one in Zambia and one in Angola. And then at one point, some of the special forces, they went into the camp in Zambia and they planted an electronic beacon in the middle of the camp, so that our planes could just go across and bomb the whole place to pieces. If we'd been Israel, we would have done it, definitely. But then the whole thing was called off. And there was another incident where the same general told me about, there was a house in Lesotho, which is a small country in the middle of South Africa. It's sort of a landlocked country that was given independence. Well, it was sort of made a British protectorate in the 19th century, and then it became independent in the 1960s. And that was used as a springboard for attacks against us at the time. And there was a house there where one of the communist leaders, who was later assassinated by a Polish immigrant to South Africa, Janusz Walus, he spent more time in prison than Nelson Mandela, and nobody knows about that. And he was released about a year ago. But Chris Hani, the guy he eventually assassinated, was in that house. And the special forces, they'd already got their weapons in place and everything, and they were going to take that out that house, including Chris Hani. And eventually the operation, and the military wanted to do it, but the government, I think the foreign minister or someone, he said no, yes, the head of the army, General Constant Viljoen, he said no, but there's a woman and child sleeping in that house, and they could be hurt during this operation, so we can't go ahead with it. So again, if it had been Israel, they would have long wiped it out completely. So it's kind of, Machiavelli also says something to the same effect, but nice guys come second. And that's why we are where we are at the moment. And of course, when this sort of definition of apartheid that they eventually came up with at the United Nations, I mean, they actually took the language from the Genocide Convention, most of it, and they applied that to the so-called apartheid policy in South Africa. But that was never meant to be a genocide against anybody. On the contrary, during that time, our black population grew from about 10 million to almost 30 million. So, it was sort of something that was based on a lot of the ideas of Woodrow Wilson, self-determination, and self-determination even to this day is thrown about as a term among Afrikaners, and they also want self-determination for themselves, because we've been fighting for that for the last 2 centuries against the British Empire, and now we are in a situation where we are completely dominated by this kind of quasi-communist Afro-Saxon government regime, and we supposedly have a democracy, and we've just had a vote, an election, but the whole system was designed in such a way to actually just checkmate us completely politically, and they drew the boundaries of the provinces in such a way, and even of the municipalities, that we won't, because we are outnumbered almost everywhere, we will never have any say in government. And so in the last election, most Afrikaners vote for the liberal opposition called the DA. And some of the old leaders of the DA, some of the old liberal leaders, they cooperated very closely, in the Progressive Party, and especially Mrs. Helen Suzman, they cooperated very closely with the ANC, working against our old government. So it's another irony that we should now be supporting this liberal party that in the past was working for our downfall. But if you apply then the international definition, or the UN's definition of apartheid, which is a form of genocide and repression and denying people fundamental rights and so on, then yes, it fits. It doesn't fit the old South Africa's policies at all, because we had some very sophisticated professors and political scientists who wrote thick books about government policy towards Black people and how we're going to solve this conundrum of Black rights in South Africa. I mean, they debated it for a whole century. Liberals and conservatives and everybody did, but the worst possible option was always defined as sort of a one-man, one-vote system, winner takes all, so that the Black majority would gain permanent power in South Africa. And in the end, that is what we got in the early 1990s, although nobody ever voted for that. We were sort of misled in that famous referendum of 1992. And I'm sure if the honest question had been put then, whether we wanted to be in this kind of one-man, one-vote system, with centralized power, everybody would have voted against it. But there was a whole, there was so much skullduggery and manipulation at the time that we were simply railroaded into the system, and now we are caught out. We sort of imprisoned by it. And but yes, you're quite right in that the UN definition of apartheid, which are now applying to Israel, and in fact, there's a South African liberal professor who I used to know him back in my student days. His name is John Dugard, and he was also the UN rapporteur on Palestine at one point, and he actually played a big role in that court case at The Hague against Israel. And they were applying that definition of apartheid now to Israel, but it could be easily applied to our situation here as well, because we are suffering violence. We are suffering cultural and racial discrimination. We are being, I think one of the sections of that convention says that when you are trying to eliminate a group on the basis of its ethnicity, its language, race, and so on, then that is apartheid, and that is a crime against humanity. And that is exactly the policy that the ANC is applying against us in South Africa. I was almost livid with anger when I saw it the other day, because in this province, which is now, I mean, they cut up the country into 9 provinces, which is also absurd. But this province where I live, where Johannesburg is, this is a new one, which they call Gauteng, which is a sort of a funny word. It's not even an African word. It's sort of a, I don't know, kind of a pidgin word or something, but which means gold thing, Gauteng. But here, I mean, this is because of it's the financial center and the industrial center, more or less, of the country. It's sort of a bit like the Randstad in the Netherlands, or, maybe the Golden Horseshoe in Canada, or whatever. It's the wealthiest part of the country, and it represents something like 35% of the GDP of South Africa, which is in a very small area about the size of Israel. That's the size of this province, 20,000 square kilometers. There's a man here from the ANC called Panyaza Lesufi, and he's extremely anti-Afrikaans, anti-white, and there were various incidents where, for example, somebody sent some innocent little video or cell phone photo snapshot of a black child at kindergarten, something like that. And because the black child was sitting alone for just one instant at this table, and there were a few white kids at the next table, but it was a complete coincidence. He immediately went to that school, which was a private kindergarten, and there was a whole big media circus around it, and he tried to close it down. He's done things like that lots of times, and he's also got a plan. He's been trying to close down the Afrikaans schools in this province. And there are about 1.5 to 2 million Afrikaners living in this province, in this financial and industrial hub of South Africa. So this is where most of us live, and this is also in the old Transvaal, where we used to be independent, a bit more than 100 years ago. And he's trying to anglicize our schools, or close them down, and just swamp our schools with black kids who will demand to be taught in English and so on. And and now this liberal DA party, he was the premier of this province, and now they've actually, even though the ANC only got 35% of the vote here in this province because of all the internecine squabbling among the black politicians and the ethnic strife as well, which we know from centuries ago. I mean, there's never been a kind of there's no one black nation in South Africa, unlike what people might think overseas. There are various tribes or national groups or ethnic. It's a multinational country, and which we tried to address in the past, but it's now sort of fallen by the wayside. And yeah, he only got 35% of the vote, but now they've made him premier of this province again, with the help of the liberal DA that all the Afrikaners voted for. So, it's a bit like the turkeys voting for Christmas or something. It's just completely absurd. Why should this person be put in charge of the province when he's so openly, filled with hatred for us and for who we are and for our language and our race and everything that goes together with that?
I think
so. I mean, in fact, he's going to apply apartheid against us. I mean, in fact, Martin Bosma of the Dutch Freedom Party, he once told me, that he uses term ANC apartheid. And in fact, by the UN's definition, the ANC is applying apartheid to us. We never had apartheid according to the UN definition in this country, and it had various other fancy names in the past by, thought up by all these political scientists and constitutional experts and so on that we had in the past. They call it plural democracy and separate development and national self-determination, etc., etc. It was only called apartheid for a very short period, maybe in the 1940s. But after that, the term sort of died a death as things got more complicated. And in fact, if you want to understand the real conflict in South Africa, it was a sort of a Boer-Britain conflict from the beginning, from the arrival of the British for the first time in 1795, and they stayed for a few years, and then there were some changes in Europe with the Napoleonic Wars, and then yes, the Netherlands was actually invaded by Napoleon. Wasn't that the Batavian Republic? And during the Batavian Republic, we had another.
We were under a naval blockade, so it was impossible to send a relief fleet to South Africa to recapture the colony. That was the issue.
Then we had for 3 years we had a Dutch government, Dutch administration again in the Cape, and then in 1806 they sent a whole British fleet to the Cape under Admiral Baird or someone, and then they took over the Cape again. Although there was resistance, I mean, there was a battle or a few battles, but there was also kind of a betrayal, because the one guy who was the leader, Gordon, he wanted to actually work with the British because he wanted to keep his post, and so he at one point he said, no, we'll just surrender, and so on. And then from then on, there's been the British influence in South Africa. But another big conflict was an ideological conflict around how one should approach African or Black development in this country. And there were two schools of thought that came out of the missionaries, and there was the Berlin Missionary Society and the London Missionary Society. And the Berlin Missionary Society wanted to train people in trades and give them marketable skills and skills to build and to do masonry and, woodwork and things like that. Whereas the British one was oriented towards creating an intellectual class, which, as time wore on, was actually literally a sort of a class of Marxist intellectuals. People like Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo. They came out of the Anglican and the British missionary education system. And that's how we ended up with this class of nomenclatura who are radicalized and who have never done a stitch of work in their lives. They just do politics from day and night. And Smuts was actually, in the first half of his life, he was a Boer general, and he was Kruger's state attorney. But he then, of course, became enamored of the British Empire because he'd studied at Cambridge, and he was also flattered and by the British royal family and the British government. And there's even online, you can go and look for it. There's sort of an assembly of both houses of parliament in the UK during the Second World War, where they were addressed by Smuts, and he had a standing ovation from both the lower house and the House of Lords. And Churchill introduced him.
He was the old
lionized him and so on. So Smuts was their guy, and but he said some very interesting things here and again. And in fact, he was also, in a way, the father of apartheid, because of this system of separate development and sort of limited self-determination for various ethnic groups in South Africa. Normally they say that Verwoerd was born in Holland. He was born in Amsterdam, in fact. He became prime minister in South Africa in the 1950s. A brilliant man. He had a PhD in sociology, and he studied in Germany, and he he was a really a very interesting figure, old Hendrik Verwoerd, and born in Amsterdam. I even went to his, I got taken to his birthplace in Amsterdam. It was very interesting to see it there. But he's normally blamed for the past policies of South Africa. But in fact, if you look at, there's a book of Smuts' speeches. And in 1928, he enunciated this whole policy in Oxford before a British audience. And he said that we should apply this thing throughout the whole of Africa. And he even wanted South Africa, he wanted Britain to give South Africa, to make us even bigger, and to give us the northern and southern Rhodesia to govern as well, which would have made it sort of a mini empire here. But the British they weren't prepared to do that, because they were scared that South Africa would then become so powerful that it could rival Britain here in Africa. And I think that's been part of the whole problem, is that at one point, especially during Verwoerd's reign in the early 1960s, South Africa was growing so fast economically, and there was full employment, and that we were in danger of becoming a kind of an African superpower, and people wanted to stop that. And in fact, in our own thinking, I don't think we actually realized what was happening to us at the time. And we were still coming from this kind of Anglo-Boer war struggle, and the struggle for sovereignty and independence, because we didn't even have our own embassies until the 1930s. And up until then, South Africa didn't, we had to go through the British embassy. Britain controlled our foreign policy. So, and in fact, we were sort of on the verge of becoming some kind of a Southern African empire. And we had the 2 Portuguese colonies there, but also, Southern Rhodesia, that became what was almost like a vassal state to South Africa, at least economically. I mean, we supplied them with everything that they needed, even though from the mid-60s onwards, Britain was applying sanctions to Rhodesia as a result of UDI, or their unilateral declaration of independence. But I think if we had been, Smuts was more of an, he wrote a book, a very interesting book that I read as well about, he was also a scientist and botanist, and he was very interested in African grasses, and he did research on that, and he was a naturalist as well, Smuts. And he wrote a book on holism. And he had this conception also, he was more of a sort of a broader kind of imperially minded thinker. And I think but of course the National Party and the Afrikaner nationalists, they absolutely hated Smuts, but if they had applied some of his thinking to what was going on in South Africa at the time, and seen that in order to maintain ourselves here, to survive, we would have to define ourselves in terms of spheres of influence on all these countries around us, like the Portuguese colonies and like Rhodesia and so on. And we shouldn't let any of those dominoes fall, because ultimately, the domino, we would become the last domino to fall. And that's exactly what happened, because we also governed, of course, Southwest Africa, which is also, it's a very dry kind of arid country with a large desert, but it's almost the size of South Africa. If you put the two together, it's bigger than Western Europe by far. And since the First World War, Southwest Africa, or the current Namibia, was governed as a 5th province of South Africa. So we had this huge territory, which was prosperous and developing. And, if we had maintained this kind of architecture that we had in Verwoerd's time, none of these bad things would have happened to us. But then we started, I call it turprop, sort of terrorism plus propaganda, and that's a deadly combination, because when people vilify you all the time, and they accuse you of being murderer, and kind of people committing genocide and whatever, crime against humanity. And at the same time, you've got people being terrorized in shopping centers and post offices and so on. I mean, the ANC let off about 200 bombs in South Africa in the 1980s, and those were supplied by East Germany and funneled here by Dutch people from the anti-apartheid movement. And there was that woman, Helene Pasteur. She was actually Flemish. She transported the Pretoria, the Pretoria Church Street bomb that killed 19 people and injured 200. It was a horrible day. That it was about the 20th of May 1983. So we had West Europeans cooperating with the East Germans, and to actually wage this kind of, what would you call it, an asymmetric kind of a war against us. And I think there are a lot of lessons in there for Western countries today, because you may think you've got a powerful military and big military budget and all of that, but once they get at you through propaganda coupled with urban terrorism, terrorizing the population, then it saps the will of the people to resist. And eventually, as happened here, I mean, the ANC took over this country without firing a single shot. And they, from the old National Party's point of view, that they negotiated for a new constitution, but that's not the way the ANC sees it. They see it as a kind of a military victory, and they've often expressed it in those terms. And I've even seen some of the more left-wing academics who also describe it in those terms. They say that, even though there was never the final battle of Pretoria or anything like that, what happened and the scope of this change that happened in 1994 was akin to a kind of a military victory. It was as if, the Red Army had taken over South Africa and instituted a new system. Now, ironically, I didn't think today, the Russians are, obviously there's a lot of controversy around Ukraine and so on, but the Russians are no longer really hostile towards us, and they've got strange ways of sort of justifying what they did in the past now, and then they see it in terms of decolonization or something like that. But the Russian diplomats in Pretoria are fairly friendly towards Afrikaners, unlike many of the Western countries who would not associate with us at all, even to this day, even though we had done everything they wanted us to do and handed over power on a silver platter to this absolutely corrupt bunch of internationalist kind of, I call them zombie communists, because, at the time in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, I was in Berlin a month before that, in October 1989. You would have thought that this whole system would just be, and it was finished and it fallen by the wayside, but in fact, elements of that and we had a communist party associated with the ANC that came to power in South Africa, and they still call one another comrade and so on, and they still operate in terms of that ideology. And they, and a few years ago, they were still saying things about, the term that they have for the 1994 change is the National Democratic Revolution, because they think in terms of sort of Lenin's theory of a two-stage revolution, that they would first, and I think Marx and Engels said that as well, you first have a bourgeois revolution, and then you have a socialist revolution later on. Now, 1994 was our bourgeois revolution, our national democratic revolution, as they call it, and then there would be a socialist revolution afterwards. And you know, these parties along the left-wing fringe, like the EFF, who also got almost 10% of the vote this time with his, I don't know what you mean, is very outspoken, and he's almost like a cartoon kind of a leader, this Julius Malema, who wears a pair of red overalls. He definitely thinks in terms of that, of having a second revolution during which, you know, there would be nationalization of the banks and the land, and we would have radical socialism in this country. And they even call it the radical economic transformation, RET. Because in South Africa, because of the old government, they tended to prohibit outright kind of revolutionary propaganda. That was not allowed. So, you know, and most governments have some form of legislation that, I mean, you can see in the Netherlands now, Mr. Gideon van Meijeren, he's just been found guilty of advocating violence against the state, even though he said almost nothing. Whereas in the past, we had all these Marxist theorists and intellectuals and leaders and people in the trade unions that would also make very radical statements. You couldn't propagate sort of outright insurrection, violence, rebellion against the state. That was sort of prohibited. But at the same time, there was a lot of freedom of speech for people to say what they wanted and to speak in code language and so on. And one of the words, they avoided the term revolution. And then they substituted that with transformation. So revolution, transformation. And everybody on the left knew about this. So you don't say revolution, you say transformation. And that term has now become the term in South Africa for revolution, and it's used by the government all the time. Transformation, we need more transformation, and there's not enough transformation. And it's also got now a racial connotation. When you replace whites with black people, or say Indian people or colored people, then there's transformation. And they've legislated that as well. And there are about 120 laws requiring transformation throughout the public and the private sector. Yes, so we are in a kind of a very topsy-turvy world here.
One of the things I found interesting about your analysis of present predicament of the Afrikaner people is your concept of that you spoke about in the Raiders of the Lost Empire. So you had an essay published in English, the Raiders of the Lost Empire, and you talk in this essay about the role of Anglocentrism, Anglomania, as a tool of subversion, as a means by which a nation becomes oblivious to its own interests, loses its culture, is being dominated by an imperial culture instead of its own. And you see that phenomenon happening between white people in South Africa, the Afrikaners. You call them I think there's a beautiful word called the South Peel. That's an Englishman in South Africa who has a certain part of his anatomy hanging in the sea between himself, between South Africa and England. And these people,
I'm actually learning Russian at the moment because I got interested in the language, and there are a whole lot of words in Russian that have a sort of a homophone in the Russian language, and every time I have to say these words, in front of the teacher with a P word, as we call it, it's a little bit embarrassing. Yes.
Yeah, but this word it describes very well the mentality of the Anglos, the English, white English people who came to South Africa, of which there are, of course, also quite a number, I think over 1 million. And these people, they seem to function like a kind of a fifth column, and they infect also the culture of upper class or elite Afrikaners. It is a phenomenon that has a parallel in Europe, I think. So also our European elites, continental elites, get Anglified, become Anglophile, become Anglo-Saxon oriented. And you said you in your essay even that is applicable to African, native black African people. You call them the Afro-Saxons. So not the Anglo-Saxons, but the Afro-Saxons. People that take on the mentality of the empire, the heirs of the empire, attend to the culture of the empire, the globalist Anglo-Saxon empire, and who are oblivious to their own identity, who wish to take on the identity, let's say like the Indians in the Raj. Some of them, they wanted to be more English than the English. In Afrikaans, of course, you say Britsgezinde, so somebody that's oriented towards the British Empire. You talked about Smuts and his double role in this regard. And it seems that there is a weakness among other people of European descent, including the Afrikaners that are not Anglo-Saxon, that they look up to that globalist Anglo-Saxon imperial model culturally, that they are susceptible to its propaganda, its values, its supposed values, and its power structures. It's a very interesting topic because it points to some kind of a weakness. And I like to quote something that you wrote in Afrikaans. So what you are saying is, die Afrikaanse cultuur is onlosmakelijk verbind aan die taal. So the Afrikaner culture is bound to language. And then you say, so what is my association with this? This is earthliness, sensuality, and striving for peace and freedom. That's something that's typically Afrikaner. And you say a certain amount of ascesis and stoicism is in this. And it is reflected in the legendary Boer hospitality. It is a virility that already Tacitus saw in the Germans of his time, the Germanic tribes of his time. But unfortunately also, this includes characteristics such as Calvinism, moralism, smallness, an aping of everything that's English. And you use the German word Schwärmerei. Once upon a time, the South Africans, the Afrikaners, used to be quite a formidable opponent to the British Empire. So not only in the Boer Wars, which took an enormous empire 3 years to subdue 2 very small countries, but also, for example, in the form of the Afrikaner Broederbond. So you had a political secret organization that was actually geared towards the defense of your people. What happened to these defense mechanisms? What happened to that mentality? How is it possible that we have seen that complete capitulation? And is there any kind of renaissance in the coming? What's your take on that?
Well, yes, all of these institutions were, of course, undermined, and in fact, because over time, I think they got stronger and more centralized, and eventually, because it was so centralized, it was possible if you could undermine the center, then the entire edifice would just fall, and that's exactly what happened. And de Klerk, his brother was very active in the Broederbond at one point. He was also he was an academic and a journalist, and he was also the editor of one of the newspapers here in the Transvaal. His name was Willem de Klerk. And apparently he went on in the 1980s. He was sort of feted by the British Secret Service there in London. And they explained to him what he was supposed to do to get rid of these sanctions against South Africa. And he went and told his brother, this is the plan. And I think the two of them agreed to it. And he sold it to the people in the Broederbond. And I think just before de Klerk declared, when he went to ahead to free Nelson Mandela and unban the ANC, he had a meeting with the leaders of the Brederbond, and he told them, this is the plan, and everybody agreed to it, and so it all went ahead. I mean, P.W. Botha, I actually visited him twice when he was fairly elderly already. Very interesting discussions that I had with him. I mean, for example, apparently we supplied some of the bombs that the Israelis used in the 67 war to Weizmann or some other Israeli leader that came in a ship to Cape Town and asked him for that. But he also told me interesting things about de Gaulle and one of the French defense ministers who also told him that de Gaulle was of the opinion that we were very important in the Western architecture, and that France should look after us because we were hard done by during the religious wars in France and the Bartholomew Night and all of that, when the French Huguenots had to flee France, and a lot of them came here, of course. But P.W. Botha said that he would release Mandela even in the 1980s already, if he would forswear violence, if he would, say, if he would become peaceful, or he would no longer support the violent overthrow of the government. And Mandela refused to do that. He said something to the effect that, I mean, this is probably scripted for him by somebody else, but he said that prisoners cannot enter into bargains or something to that effect, So Mandela essentially wanted to have a free reign. He would be able to get out of prison and then still be able to propagate violence and resistance and protest, and they had this phrase, making the country ungovernable, and that's precisely what they tried to do, because there was a huge, after the release of Mandela, I mean, South Africa was actually in the late 1980s was actually very peaceful, because they'd actually, the police and the army and the security services, even though the army wasn't, they were to some extent also involved in policing work, but they'd managed actually to sort out most of the problems, and we were by far ahead of any other country in terms of riot control and things like that. The Europeans are only now getting to know what it means, to have third world people going into riots and so on, and they are struggling with this at the moment. But we had a lot of experience in that, and the country is peaceful in the late 1980s. But if you look at the statistics in South Africa, then immediately from the early 90s, when Mandela was released, the violence just suddenly exploded, and it's never it's never diminished ever since then. There's still a huge amount of violence, and there are more protests now than ever before. There's criminal violence, but there's also kind of these little insurrections, and they call them service delivery protests. That's a sort of a euphemism for looting and, blocking roads and burning stuff down. It's so since then we've been immersed in this culture of violence, but I think it was because the power structure was too centralized, and I think that it was too. The thinking was also intellectually, the National Party and the Brederbond became very incestuous. There was no, they'd actually excluded most of the critical people on the right and on the left from their own circles. So they were in this little echo chamber, and they thought that they understood this problem, but they didn't. They had no notion of what was on the other side. They didn't have any schooling in Marxism or revolutionary theory. Some of the people in the intelligence services did. But even some of them, I mean, P.W. Botha also made a big mistake because he appointed some professor from Bloemfontein as the head of the intelligence service. And this guy was a complete egghead. He wasn't somebody, well, I see in Holland, they're now going to appoint former head of the intelligence service as the prime minister of the country. I wonder how that's going to work out. But yeah, I mean, well, George Bush, I suppose, wasn't he head of the CIA at one point as well? But yeah, I mean, this guy didn't have a real insight into what he was confronted with. And he was also manipulated by the British and probably the CIA and other people. And in that way, I mean, our own intelligence service actually sort of prepared the surrender, really, and the betrayal of our people in the early 90s.
Yeah, and as a final point, I would like to bring up another betrayal that I see sometimes in our own dissident movement in Europe. Of course, you are a tireless speaker for your people. You are a race realist. You are a realpolitik oriented person. And you have been speaking to many people in the dissident movement, including Jared Taylor. Which brings me to this point of betrayal. There are many white nationalists, so-called white nationalists, so that's in America and in Europe, who say that each nation, of course, should have its own homeland. So a volksstaat in Afrikaans that would be. But there are many among them who actually think that the Afrikaners, so the white people of South Africa who have been living there since 1652, should be so-called reintegrated to Europe. They should be brought back to Europe, and South Africa should be left to the black people because they are supposedly the indigenous inhabitants. Not saying the truth, of course, because the indigenous inhabitants before the Europeans were the Khoisan. And how indigenous are you after 350 years? So I find this a kind of betrayal. People arguing for a whole nation of, let's not forget, 2.7 million people to be uprooted out of the place that they created a completely new nation, completely new culture, completely new language in. And of course, there are also projects by friendly states, we can call Russia that, allowing Afrikaners to settle, for example, on agricultural land in the North Caucasus and so on, or around Moscow. And of course, some Afrikaners, they took up this kind of offers. And some people in Europe, they are susceptible to this idea that the Afrikaners should be repatriated. When I was in South Africa, I saw that the Afrikaners, they are African people. They are now African people. It's in their name. And it seems to me a very unfair approach. What do you think about that approach? The approach of, let's just have all those the white people from South Africa remigrate, not only the English Zoutpielen, but everybody, including the Afrikaners. What's your take on that? What does this idea come from? This fatalism, this very ahistorical look at ethnicity and issues around it. What's your take?
Before I answer that, could you excuse me for a minute? Could we? In response to your question, yes, I've also, come across that sort of attitude from some people, especially in America, because America is sort of an immigrant country, and they have the notion that, America, everybody wants to become American. I mean, an American, sort of liberal American once told me that being born American is one of the greatest gifts that one can have. And, because it just opens so many doors for you, and you sort of living in the pinnacle of power and civilization and so on. But I suppose you could ask the same, in order to understand the problem, I think you could ask the same question, say, about the Icelanders. I mean, there are only 300,000 Icelanders living in a fairly inhospitable place, and you could tell them, why don't you come and fill up a few suburbs in Virginia or something like that, become American and leave all that. They've got 1,000. Yeah, Icelandic is actually, even though it's such a small language group, it's one of the oldest Indo-European languages, of course. And I suppose you could say the same about the Norwegians or the Flemish or anybody else, any other, like the Estonians. There are only 1.2 million Estonians, and currently, the irony is that the United States, amongst others, is now in its competition with Russia and this new Cold War that's that pertains in Europe at the moment. They're saying that if Estonia's sovereignty and self-determination gets affected by the Russians, then there will be war between the United States and Russia, or between NATO and Russia. But nobody is defending our sovereignty here, neither from the left nor the right, or they just say, okay, just leave that place. It's just too horrible for you. So, but it's actually, even today, and we've sort of adapted to a lot of the violence and crime. And there are areas in South Africa where you are fairly safe. Europe is also experiencing huge problems regarding crime and insecurity now, and in many cities in America, it's almost as bad as in South Africa. So, and yes, we have roots here. We have shed blood here, and this is really a very, it's a very valuable piece of real estate, even apart from all our minerals, and of course the gold under the. Much of the fight between the British Empire and us was over the value of our minerals, and especially the gold that's now more or less depleted, although, there are still mines going, but it's not, we used to be the world's top producer with 80% of the world's gold production, but it's far lower now, and we're sort of sliding down the ranking. It's also because of this government that has actually also imposed affirmative action and so on the mining industry, and a lot of the mining groups have just decided, even the indigenous ones have decided to leave South Africa because they can't stand their legislation anymore. But even apart from that, the value under the surface of our country, it's a very stable, geologically stable environment. It's got a very nice climate. It's a bit dry, and we have droughts and so on, but it's when the old pioneers, the fur trackers, came across the mountains to this part of the world in the interior, this plateau that's high above sea level, it was an absolute paradise also for animals. There were thousands of buck and antelopes here, and that they could just hunt and so on in the initial stages. So it's a very healthy sort of climate as well. But our problem is really, it's a demographic problem more than anything else, and I'm afraid this same problem is going to engulf the rest of the planet within the next few decades, because the African population growth, you can just look at the UN's figures there and the graphs. There are going to be, there's about 1.5 billion Africans at the moment, and they're going to double within the next 20 to 30 years, and then after that they're going to double again. So, and Africa, apart from South Africa, doesn't have infrastructure to support large populations, and even our infrastructure under this current regime is crumbling. So they are probably going to immigrate, and they're going to go to Europe and to North America. So everyone is going to be confronted with the same problem. So you get about a 10 to 20 year kind of a reprieve, and then you are plunged into the same kind of a state as we are here in South Africa. Now, there are South Africans and even Afrikaners who are immigrating, and there are groups, on Facebook and so on. And there's a group for immigrants to the Netherlands, to Australia, to New Zealand, to the United States, and to Canada. And they are sort of helping each other to immigrate. And it's very difficult because most of the other countries don't really want us there. And they make it's only the people with really good qualifications, engineers or accountants, who maybe medical people who manage to get working, get employment visas and that sort of thing. So the rest of us are really trapped here. We can't really, even if we want to go, the vast majority of the population wouldn't be able to, because according to the current criteria, we don't qualify for immigration to most other Western countries. But yes, we've got, we managed to settle this country over a vast area. Even though we are a small number of people, we are spread all over the country. We know what's going on everywhere. We settled all these towns and created infrastructure and roads and electricity and everything. So we're sort of in survival mode at the moment, but it's not such a bad thing, because then you start to think about what's important and what isn't, and you get your priorities right. People have to look at their income and what they're going to do to survive, and to earn money in some other way, while most of the state and the private sector won't employ you on. They're just excluding you on ethnic grounds. They're saying, well, we only take what they call it. What's the abbreviation they use in the United States?
The BIPOC?
Equity, inclusion, and diversity.
DIE, yes.
Yes, DIE, yes. Now, they don't call it that here, but it's the same thing. So, if you don't fit those criteria, then you won't get a job. And even at most of the institutions, they've just got, this is sort of, my generation is the last generation that I think used to have those jobs in the formal sector. If you don't start your own business, or if you don't work online for some other foreign company in another part of the world, you won't get a job. And that is, in a way, it's a very harsh sort of environment, but at the same time, there are young people who start their own businesses and become successful, and they don't need anybody. They don't need institutions. They're not only surviving, but they are thriving, and they travel and they become very skilled at what they do. So we were sort of also breeding a new group of survivalists in South Africa that might be beneficial to other people. We could be giving other people lessons, maybe in a decade or two, in how to deal with some of the problems that we are being confronted with. And then even regarding the violence and the criminality and the insecurity, there are large networks all over the country where people cooperate, and farmers cooperate with one another, and they protect one another. They go on patrols, and they become self-sufficient. They no longer depend on the state to protect them. And that is also an interesting development, because I think in most of Western Europe, if people aren't protected by the police, they don't even have guns or anything like that, they would be extremely vulnerable if there's sort of a breakdown in public order, and the police service, like the one we've got here, cannot protect you. They would be out on a limb trying to fend for themselves, because they haven't got the mentality or the training or the armaments or self-defense. Even though I mean, this government has also made it extremely difficult for us to own guns. I mean, there are all sorts of bureaucratic impediments to owning arms, but a lot of people do go to the trouble to actually go through the whole process of getting a gun license, and then going through the process of registering your guns and all that sort of stuff. And I mean, I've been to homes or farms or wherever where people own dozens of weapons, and even classic weapons, and even some old armored vehicles and stuff from the Second World War and later. It's so, people, it's amazing what you come across in this country, because we've still got this pioneering sort of spirit, and so we tend to fend for ourselves. I mean, you spoke about the Afrikaner as a sort of a virile people, and especially around the Anglo-Boer War. I mean, there were so many of the British commentators who, I mean, first of all, there was a significant pro-Boer movement in the United Kingdom that was actually against the war, and they didn't want Britain to make war against us because they saw it as a sort of an internecine struggle, and that was not conducive to anything. But even from the people on the British officer corps and so on, I mean, there were reports and so on, and commentary even from journalists, and somebody like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes books, where they also wrote things that admiring us and how well we survived in the veld and in the bush and in the wild, and that we were these bearded men on horseback that were excellent shots, and that we could take on anybody. So yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of that that has survived, and we're not as decadent as a lot of the Europeans and the North Americans, and we've kept a sort of an certain endogenous culture as well, where we don't, I mean, obviously the English and Afrikaans speakers, they intermarry a lot among each other, but we don't really intermarry with the other people in this country. It's very rare to see that. Whereas if you go to a place like Paris, I mean, it's just, I mean, the French left-wing politician Jean-Luc Mélenchon has just said that he wants to see the creolization of France. That is the answer for him to France's ethnic problems, is creolization. And he's propagating that as part of the policy of his party. And if you go to a place like Paris, you can almost see that happening. Whereas here, it doesn't happen at all. I mean, there was a bit of that shortly after 1994. Some of the liberal women were intermarrying with Africans and so on, but that sort of stopped within a few years. And now, so we are sort of surviving. We are managing to reproduce ourselves, and we are in a predicament here. But now this, I mean, with all the corruption and the incompetence of the current regime, they're now cooperating with a liberal opposition that has a white leader, which up until a few years ago, it was unthinkable. Then even this Liberal Party had to have a black leader, but now he's got a white leader, even though he's an English speaker from Natal, from KwaZulu-Natal, which is the sort of most colonially British province in South Africa, as you probably know. So we just have to try and survive and protect our population, and then come up with ways of maintaining ourselves in this part of the world. And this part of the world could play a role. I mean, I don't know, nobody can predict the future. And even say if there's a nuclear war in Europe and half the place is contaminated with radioactive substances, I mean, this could be a safe haven for many Europeans. In fact, there was I was told that by Martin Bosma as well. And I mean, there was actually a Dutch politician towards the late 19th century, who was very interested in South Africa. And he said that, the Netherlands was surrounded by three very aggressive large countries in the form of the UK, England, Germany, and France, and that it wasn't a done deal that the Netherlands would survive politically for the next century or so. And there was this large territory in South Africa where a lot of Dutch people could emigrate to, and that's why they should support the Boer Republic in the Transvaal, So I think in a certain sense that, there's still that. During the communist, what's very interesting about the 1960s and so on, and this whole anti-apartheid campaign, was that first of all, it was being waged by a lot of East Europeans to deflect attention from their atrocities and their human rights abuses and so on. But a lot of the East European dissidents were very frustrated because their plight was not being published anywhere in the Western media. And the one I read the other day, a statement by some other Polish playwright, who said that he's prepared to put shoe polish on his face, black shoe polish, in order to make himself acceptable to the Western media. And a lot of the Eastern European dissidents, thousands of them came to South Africa during the after the Second World War. Czechs and Poles and especially Czechs and Poles came to South Africa, and something like the same order could happen again, because even though this government is very hostile, at the same time, it's getting weaker by the minute. It doesn't really control the territory. It doesn't control the borders very well. In fact, there's a whole school of thought now. There's one sort of legal scholar in Pretoria who writes about the state and all sorts of legal issues, and he's saying that to a certain extent the state is withering away in South Africa, and the community groups and such as the Afrikaners and farmers and neighborhood watchers in suburbs, they are taking over a lot of the functions of the state, and the private sector is also taking over functions of the state. And then you're looking at of course, we had an energy crisis and an electricity crisis in this country due to the corruption in the state-owned electricity company called Eskom. But within a very short space of time, we've now switched over to, private individual solar power, and companies and businesses have also done that. So we've almost overcome that problem, and it's all been a spontaneous kind of a private initiative.
It's very interesting what you say, because that means that the Marxists who came to power made true the Marxist prediction that the state would wither away, but not in the way that they were thinking or hoping.
Yes, exactly. In fact, I've made that point, that, where Karl Marx spoke about withering away of the state, it's actually happening here, but not under, the conditions that Marx predicted. It's something, in fact, happening under a Marxist government, but where their own power is slowly dissolving before our very eyes. And I think that makes it, what's really important is, what we're doing at the moment, that there has to be thinking and meta politics, and we have to understand what's going on here. Because I always maintain that the old government, they had the tremendous army, very disciplined, well equipped, well trained, and police force, We had embassies in the most beautiful parts of the Western world, in Washington, in London, in Bonn, in Amsterdam, well, at The Hague and everywhere. But and we had all those diplomats, but that ultimately they failed because of a lack of sort of intellectual preparation and because of their thought processes that were not up to the task. And I think if we can now, if we can intellectually prepare ourselves and reason this whole thing out as to where we should be going, I think then there's still a lot of hope for us here. And we still, we still got our farmers who, ever since for the last 30 years, they've threatened to actually expropriate the farmers and farmland and so on. But because of their, incapacity, and it hasn't happened, even though it's been the policy. It was even announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa a year or two ago that they are now going to expropriate land without compensation. And they even passed a law in Parliament enabling them to do that. The farmers are still farming, and we still have beautiful vegetables and fruit and meat and whatever. You can eat so well in South Africa at a much lower price than anywhere else in the world. I see stuff on social media about Canada, and people can't survive there because things have become so expensive, whereas we are still, we can still survive.
Well, on this very unexpectedly high note, I think we can conclude our podcast. I'd like to remind our audience that the Dutch they had only one settlement colony, so that was South Africa. And we always think that the English, they chose the easy ones. They chose Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and America, because it was an easy place to go. But South Africa is a very challenging place. It's a place where only the hardy can survive. Today, we had Mr. Dan Roodt telling us about how that persists, how that pioneering spirit persists, and what strategies might help us. That all being said, I thank you very much, Mr. Roodt, for your time. We hope to see you once again on Arctos one day. And we wish you luck with all your endeavors and all your projects to raise awareness of Afrikaans culture and for the project of Afrikaner survival in his own homeland. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for an interesting interview.